There is a strange kind of peace that arrives when you stop pretending you're okay. A soft unraveling, like exhaling after holding your breath for far too long. Not because everything suddenly makes sense, but because you finally stop fighting your own truth. The mask grows heavy, and one day, without fanfare or drama, you simply let it fall. Not for attention, not for applause, but because you can no longer bear the weight of being someone you are not. The quiet man of the village had watched many people come to this point, each in their own time, each in their own way. He never hurried them, never tried to speed up their process. He understood something most do not, that awakening cannot be rushed. It's not an intellectual realization. It's not a checklist you complete. It's a dismantling, and dismantling takes time. There was a woman who arrived in the village one autumn, her eyes tired, her spirit frayed. She had spent her life in service to everyone but herself. As a daughter, she had learned obedience. As a wife, she had learned endurance. As a mother, she had learned sacrifice. Somewhere along the way, she had forgotten how to breathe for herself. She came to the man not with questions, but with silence. She sat beneath the fig tree where so many others had come, and she simply wept. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. Her tears were not asking for answers. They were asking for space. And so he gave her that space. After a while, she looked up and said, "I don't know how to begin again." He nodded. "Then don't begin. Just rest. Let the old self end." She didn't know what that meant at first, but something in her recognized the truth in it. She had spent her life beginning, starting over, pushing forward. She had never been taught the value of ending, of grieving, of allowing something to truly die so something new could be born. So she did something radical. She stopped. Stop trying to be strong. Stop trying to be everything. Stop trying to be understood. She let herself crumble. Not because she was weak, but because she was finally brave enough to fall apart. And in the falling, she discovered something no one had ever told her. There is a power in surrender that no amount of effort can replicate. When you surrender, not as defeat, but as devotion, you create space for something greater to move through you. Something more honest, more sacred, more real. The man knew this from his own journey. Years before, when he had first walked away from the world he knew, he thought he was making a choice. But in truth, the choice had been made for him by the part of his soul that could no longer tolerate the lie of survival. He had spent years building a life that looked successful, but underneath the structure was a hollowness he could no longer ignore. So he left, not to escape, but to return. And in that return, everything he thought he needed fell away. People often ask, "How do I know when I'm on the right path?" And he would answer, "When it no longer requires you to abandon yourself." That was the truth he had lived, the truth he invited others into, not by preaching, but by presence. He became a mirror for others, not reflecting their mass, but their essence. And in his presence, many began to remember who they were beneath the layers. There was a boy who had always felt out of place in the world, sensitive, curious, quiet. He had been told to toughen up, to be louder, to fit in. And for a time he tried. He mimicked others. He dimmed his light. He swallowed his questions, but it made him feel like a stranger to himself. When he came to the man, he asked, "Is it okay to be different?" The man smiled gently. "Different from what?" The boy paused. "From everyone else." The man placed a hand on the boy's heart. "You were never meant to be like them. You were meant to be like you." It was a simple answer, but it changed everything. The boy stopped apologizing for his silence. He started writing again, started listening to the wind, started asking questions that didn't have easy answers. And in that becoming, he felt something he had never felt before. Belonging, not to the world, but to himself. The man believed that true belonging begins within, that until you belong to yourself, every place will feel like exile. You'll always be seeking, always be striving, always be trying to prove that you are enough. But when you belong to yourself, deeply and unapologetically, you no longer need the world to give you permission. You become your own home. This was the revolution he lived, not one of power or politics, but of presence. He knew that a person rooted in their own truth was more powerful than 1,000 shouting voices. He didn't seek to change people. He simply met them, fully, and in that meeting many found themselves again. One night a man came to him trembling. He had hurt someone he loved, said things he couldn't take back, done things that haunted him. He carried his shame like chains, dragging it behind him everywhere he went. "I don't deserve forgiveness," he said. The quiet man looked into his eyes and replied, "Then start with grace." "Grace?" the man asked. "Yes, forgiveness is for others, but grace is for yourself. It's the hand you extend to the parts of you that still believe they are unworthy. It's the voice that says, you don't have to stay in the dark. Come into the light." The man wept, not because his guilt vanished, but because someone had finally seen beyond it, seen the soul beneath the mistake, and that seeing was the beginning of redemption. We live in a world quick to punish, slow to understand, but healing does not come through shame. It comes through compassion, through the quiet, steady decision to choose love again and again, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. The quiet man knew that love was not a feeling. It was a practice, a way of being, a decision to remain open even after heartbreak, a decision to speak truth even when it trembles, a decision to forgive, not because it's deserved, but because your soul deserves peace. And so he lived this love, in how he greeted the morning, in how he listened, in how he walked the earth as if it were sacred. Because to him it was. The sacred wasn't in rituals or robes, it was in presence, in the way you looked at a stranger, in the way you held your own hand when no one else could, in the way you stayed with yourself when it would be easier to leave. He once told a woman who was recovering from betrayal, "Loyalty to others is easy. Loyalty to yourself is the real work." She nodded slowly. She had spent years choosing others over herself, silencing her needs, dimming her light. And for what? Approval? Belonging? Safety? Now she was learning to choose herself, not selfishly, but sovereignly. She was learning to say no without guilt, to rest without apology, to desire without shame. It wasn't easy. The world doesn't reward women for choosing themselves, but she no longer needed the world's reward. She had tasted her own truth, and it was sweeter than any validation. And so the village changed, not dramatically, not overnight, but deeply. The people who came into contact with the man didn't become followers. They became themselves. And in becoming themselves, they created ripples. Ripples of presence, of honesty, of quiet courage. And that was always enough. There is a silence that speaks louder than noise, a stillness that begins to echo through your bones when the chaos around you no longer stirs your soul the way it used to. At first, you mistake it for emptiness, for isolation, for something missing. You feel the pull of the old life calling you back, familiar rhythms tempting you with their noise and motion. But something inside you has changed. You can't unsee what you've seen. You can't unknow what you now know. You are no longer the same, and the world you used to fit in suddenly feels like clothing 2 sizes too small. Tight, restrictive, unbearable. This is how awakening often begins, not with fire, but with the quiet crumbling of all that once held you together. You begin to realize that the routines, the conversations, the goals, the people, they no longer feel like home. They may not have done you harm, but they no longer feed the part of you that has opened. And so you begin to drift, not outward, but inward. The man who had long ago walked away from his old world and settled into silence knew this space well. He knew the ache of it, the uncertainty. He had once been so tightly woven into the expectations of others, so finely tuned to the music of belonging, that when he stopped playing along, it felt like disappearing. The silence of detachment can feel like death before it feels like birth. And yet, it is necessary, because the soul cannot bloom where it is not rooted in truth. One evening, he sat beneath the old fig tree with a woman whose eyes had begun to lose their light. She was not grieving a death, but the slow erosion of herself. She had spent years being everything to everyone, a mother, a partner, a leader. But somewhere along the way, her reflection had become unfamiliar. She no longer knew the sound of her own joy. She no longer recognized what excited her. what stirred her spirit, what made her feel alive. "I feel like a ghost in my own life," she confessed. "Like I'm here, but not really." He nodded, not out of pity, but recognition. "Maybe that's because you've been living everyone else's life but your own." She looked at him, startled by the simplicity of it. And then her eyes filled with tears, not from pain, but from the relief of being seen. "What do I do now?" she asked. "You stop," he said. "You stop trying to fix it. You stop trying to return to who you were. You let yourself fall apart, because the version of you that's crumbling isn't the real you. It's the mask, and it's okay to let it die." The dying of old selves is not something we're taught to honor. We resist it. We fight it. We try to glue the pieces back together, even when the shape no longer fits. But the man knew, as many who walk this path come to know, that something far more beautiful is being born in that breaking. The soul doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't negotiate. When it's time, it calls you inward, and everything false begins to fall away. She stayed in the village for weeks after that. At first, she tried to keep her roles alive, offering to cook, to clean, to organize things. But slowly, she began to unravel. She slept more. She cried often. She wandered without purpose. And for the first time in years, she stopped apologizing for taking up space. People asked the man, "Is she okay?" "She's healing," he replied, "not by doing more, but by finally doing less." We live in a world that tells us to fix, to hustle, to perform. But healing is rarely found in effort. It's found in rest, in release, in the sacred pause between who we were and who we're becoming. And sometimes the bravest thing we can do is nothing at all. One morning, the woman walked to the river and sat alone. She didn't bring a journal. She didn't meditate. She just watched the water move. And in that moment, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even visible. But inside, she felt a soft returning, a whisper of self, a breath of aliveness that had been buried beneath years of pretending. The quiet man once told a group of travelers, "You don't find yourself by looking harder. You find yourself by softening, by releasing, by allowing what's true to rise when you stop trying to control the outcome." And he lived this truth. He no longer rushed. He no longer planned with precision. He moved with the rhythm of nature, not the clock. And in that slowness, he found clarity. There was a young man in the village who had always been in a hurry. He carried a notebook filled with goals, timelines, strategies. He believed his worth was tied to achievement, that if he wasn't progressing, he was failing. And though he succeeded by the world's standards, he was exhausted. He came to the quiet man one evening, shoulders tense, eyes darting, voice tight. "I'm doing everything right," he said. "I'm checking all the boxes. Why do I still feel empty?" The man looked at him kindly. "Because you're living from the mind, not the soul. And the soul doesn't care about checklists. It cares about truth." "But how do I know what's true?" he asked. The man smiled. "You slow down. You listen. You feel. Truth doesn't shout. It whispers." That night, the young man put away his notebook. For the first time in years, he walked without a destination. He sat beneath the stars and let the silence say what words never could. And slowly, the urgency began to soften. We are taught to fill every moment, to prove our existence through productivity. But the most transformative moments in life are often the ones where we do nothing at all, where we simply be. In that being, something ancient returns, the remembrance of who we were before the world taught us to perform. The quiet man often said, "There's a version of you untouched by fear, unshaped by others." That version is waiting, and the only way to find it is to stop trying to be anything else. The journey back to that version is not always graceful. It can be messy, uncomfortable, terrifying, but it is the most important journey you will ever take, and no one can walk it for you. Others can sit beside you. They can hold space, but only you can meet the truth inside yourself. There was an elder in the village who had lived a long life by all external measures of success. He had wealth, family, legacy. But in the quiet of his later years, he began to feel a deep sadness. Not because of regret, but because he realized how much of his life had been lived in reaction to expectation. He had done everything right, and yet he had rarely asked himself what he truly wanted. One afternoon, he came to the quiet man with a heavy heart. "Is it too late to return to myself?" he asked. The man shook his head. "It's never too late to begin again." So the elder began again. He wrote poetry. He sang old songs. He walked barefoot in the grass. He cried often, not from sorrow but from relief. And in those final years, he felt more alive than he had in all the decades before. Because awakening doesn't require time. It requires willingness. A willingness to feel, to question, to let go. And that willingness is the beginning of everything. When the first veil begins to lift, it doesn't feel like awakening. It feels like loss. You lose your taste for small talk, your tolerance for shallow relationships, your desire for distractions that once kept you entertained. You notice how loud the world is, how quickly people speak, how rarely they listen, and something in you begins to ache, not for more stimulation, but for silence, for truth, for depth, for something real in a world that seems to have forgotten what real feels like. The quiet man knew this ache intimately. He remembered the time when it first surfaced in his own life, when laughter among crowds started to feel hollow, when success tasted flat, when even the people he once admired began to sound rehearsed. It wasn't that the world had changed, he had. Or more accurately, he was beginning to remember a version of himself the world had taught him to forget. In those early days, he resisted it. He fought to keep his place in the world he had built. He said yes when he wanted to say no. He smiled when he wanted to cry. He agreed when his entire being whispered, "This is not for you." And the more he ignored that whisper, the louder his life became. Until one day the whisper turned into a roar. Not from anger, but from insistence. The insistence of the soul refusing to be silenced any longer. So he walked away, not dramatically, not with fanfare, but gently, quietly. One small act of truth at a time. The first thing he did was slow down. He stopped rushing from place to place. He began to walk more, without a destination. He noticed the way light moved through trees, the way the wind changed directions mid-afternoon, the way birds returned to the same branch, as if it were a ritual. And in observing these things, he realized something profound. Nature does not rush, and yet everything gets done. It was the first of many lessons. Nature became his teacher. Silence became his mentor. And in that space, the real education began. There was a young mother in the village, overwhelmed and exhausted, who once asked him, "How do I find peace when there's no time, no space, no silence?" He looked at her with deep compassion. "You don't need to find peace," he said. "You need to stop chasing the life that's stealing it from you." She blinked. "But how? I have responsibilities. I have people who depend on me." "Then let your peace be the gift you give them," he replied, "because no one benefits from your burnout. Your calm is not selfish. It's medicine." The words stunned her. No one had ever told her that before. She had spent years believing her worth was tied to how much she could give, how much she could endure. She had been applauded for her sacrifices, never asked what they were costing her. That evening, she sat under the stars for the first time in months. She didn't meditate. She didn't journal. She just breathed. And for a moment, she wasn't a mother, a partner, a caretaker. She was simply a soul, resting. And in that rest, she found a kind of remembering. You see, remembering doesn't come through effort. It comes through presence, through the quiet act of being with yourself, fully and without agenda. And in that presence, the masks begin to fall. One by one, they slip away. The mask of the achiever, the mask of the pleaser, the mask of the strong one, the mask of the one who has it all figured out. And as each one drops, you begin to feel exposed, vulnerable, raw. But you also begin to feel light. There's a lightness that returns when you no longer carry the weight of who you think you're supposed to be. The quiet man often said, "The soul is not something to be built. It's something to be uncovered." There is something profoundly transformative that happens when you no longer run away from yourself. When the mirror no longer frightens you and the silence no longer feels like punishment. It doesn't happen in a single moment. It's not a grand breakthrough or a shining revelation. It's subtle, gradual, a slow softening, like thawing ice, one breath at a time, one layer at a time, until one day you look in the mirror and meet your own eyes with a kind of tenderness that once seemed impossible. The man who had long since withdrawn from the performance of the world knew this quiet rebirth well. In the earlier days before stillness became his nature, he had fought against it. He was like many, raised to believe that survival required strength, and strength meant hiding the parts of yourself that trembled. He wore armor made of expectations, smiled when he felt sorrow, nodded in rooms where his soul wanted to scream. And every time he did, a piece of him receded further from view. But something inside him refused to die. A whisper, a flicker, a pulse. And eventually that small, persistent inner truth began to rise. Not because he invited it, but because it could no longer be buried. It came in dreams, in discomfort, in moments of sudden emotion that made no sense. It came in restlessness, in the way he could no longer enjoy what he used to, in the aching longing for something he couldn't name. So he began the return, not all at once, not with confidence, but with quiet steps into the unknown. He didn't know what he was returning to. He just knew he couldn't continue the way he had, and that was enough. There was a woman in the village who was navigating her own return. She had spent most of her adult life building a fortress around herself, meticulously crafted, beautifully maintained, admired by many. She was efficient, successful, composed. But behind her eyes lived a loneliness so deep it echoed. She didn't cry, she didn't pause, she didn't ask for help, because somewhere along the way, she had learned that needing others made her vulnerable, and vulnerability, in her world, was dangerous. Then one night, her body collapsed, not in a dramatic scene, but in quiet surrender. She couldn't move, couldn't rise from bed. The fortress, built so carefully, had finally crumbled, not from outside force, but from the weight of what she had carried within. When she came to the quiet man, she didn't speak for hours. She sat beside him in stillness. He didn't ask. He didn't prod. He simply stayed. And in that staying, in that presence, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Safety. Eventually she whispered, "I don't know how to let go." He responded with the gentlest truth. "You don't need to know. You just need to stop holding." And in the days that followed, she began to release, one deep breath at a time. She allowed herself to cry, to rest, to be messy, to not have all the answers, and it terrified her. But it also freed her. The man once said, "We fear falling apart, but sometimes that's the only way to fall into place." He had seen this many times, people unraveling only to find they had been stitched together by stories that were never truly theirs. Stories of who they should be, what they should want, how they should act. And as those threads began to loosen, the truth began to emerge. There was a young man who had been taught that love must be earned, that worth was conditional, that if he wanted to be chosen, he had to become what others desired. So he became a chameleon, shifting, adjusting, pleasing. He was liked by everyone, but he was known by no one, including himself. One evening he confessed to the man, "I don't know who I am when no one's watching." The man responded, "Then let's start there. Spend a day with no roles, no mirrors, no performance, just presence. See what arises." So the young man did. He walked alone, ate in silence, turned off his phone, and slowly, like embers beneath ash, a flicker of authenticity returned. He remembered his love for drawing, something he had abandoned years ago. He noticed how good it felt to laugh without trying to be funny. He realized that beneath the layers, there was a self untouched by performance. That day didn't fix everything, but it became the first page in a new chapter. A chapter written not for others, but from within. The man believed that true healing begins when we stop trying to improve ourselves and start learning how to meet ourselves. Not the polished version, not the curated image, but the messy, raw, real self. The one that feels deeply, the one that carries shame, the one that wants to be seen but is terrified of rejection. That's the self that needs our love the most. He once said, if you only love the parts of yourself that others praise, then it's not love, it's performance. True love sees the cracks and chooses to stay. And he lived this love. He loved himself in quiet ways, by resting when tired, by speaking truth even when it trembled, by walking away from what drained him, by holding his own hand through lonely nights. This kind of self-love is not glamorous. It's not what the world sells in books and podcasts and motivational slogans. It's slow, it's soft, it's sacred. It doesn't shout, it hums, it whispers. It says, I see you, all of you, and I'm not going anywhere. There was a child in the village who once asked the man, "What does your heart sound like?" He smiled. "Like water," he said, "always moving, sometimes crashing, sometimes still, but always finding its way." And the child, wide-eyed, said, "Mine sounds like thunder." The man chuckled. "Then let it roar. Don't silence it. Listen to it. It's trying to tell you something important." That child grew up remembering that moment. In the years to come, when emotions overwhelmed him, when the world told him to be quiet, to be strong, to be normal, he remembered that his thunder wasn't a flaw. It was music, and it had its place in the world. The man had that effect on people. He didn't change them. He reminded them of their softness, of their truth, of the parts they had buried to survive. And in remembering, they began to return to their breath, return to their bodies, return to their joy, return to themselves. And the more they returned, the less they needed to escape. They no longer sought distractions to avoid their feelings. They no longer needed validation to feel worthy. They no longer feared being alone because they were no longer strangers to themselves. This is the power of presence, not to fix you, not to perfect you, but to return you. Because beneath every fear is a longing to feel safe. Beneath every mask is a longing to be seen. Beneath every wound is a longing to be held. And when we meet ourselves in these longings, not with judgment, but with love, everything begins to change. Not all at once, but enough. Enough to breathe again. Enough to soften again. Enough to believe, even just a little, that maybe, just maybe, you're not broken. You're just remembering. And that remembrance, however small, is enough. There is a shift that happens when you begin to choose yourself, not as an act of rebellion, not as a way to punish the world, but as a sacred return to what you were always meant to honor. It happens quietly. It doesn't announce itself. No one congratulates you for it. In fact, many may misunderstand it. But something deep inside of you begins to breathe again. And once it begins, there is no going back. The man who had lived in silence for many years had seen this shift in hundreds of souls. He could recognize it instantly, not by what people said, but by how they moved. There was a certain softness in their steps, a certain presence in their stillness. It was the energy of someone who had stopped outsourcing their worth. Someone who no longer needed the world's applause to feel full. He often spoke of this moment as a sacred threshold. The point where you stop seeking permission to be who you are, he once told a circle of young seekers. That is when the real journey begins. There was a young man in the village who had spent much of his life chasing perfection. His parents were proud, his teachers impressed, his friends admiring. But he lived with a constant fear that if he faltered, the love would vanish. So he worked harder. He never failed. He never cried. He never rested. And over time, the success he had built began to feel like a prison. He came to the quiet man one day, breathless with exhaustion. "I don't know how to stop performing," he said. "I've spent so long being who they needed me to be. I don't know who I am anymore." The man offered no advice, only a gentle question. "What would happen if you let yourself fall apart?" The young man stared at him, shocked. "I can't." "Why not?" "Because then they'll see I'm not perfect." The man smiled softly. "Maybe that's the point. Maybe the ones who only love your perfection were never loving you in the first place." It was a truth that took time to settle, but settle it did. That evening, the young man sat alone by the river. He didn't journal or pray or plan. He just let himself feel the fear he had buried, the fatigue, the emptiness. He cried for the first time in years, and though nothing changed on the outside, something within him shifted. The beginning of a new relationship with himself. The quiet man believed that the most important relationship you would ever have was not with your partner, your family, or your community, but with your own soul. And most people, he observed, lived estranged from it. They built their lives on expectations, on obligations, on images curated to avoid judgment. But deep down they felt hollow, not because they were broken, but because they had been living on borrowed identities. There was a woman who visited the village every spring. She was known for her wisdom, her charisma, her ability to light up any room. But each time she left, she would crumble. Alone in her home, away from the eyes of the world, she felt like a fraud. She came to the man not for answers, but to be seen without the mask. "I'm tired of being the strong one," she whispered. The man looked at her with the calm of someone who had heard that confession 1,000 times. "Then be the real one." "But the real one is scared. She's tired. She's messy." He nodded. "Then be that. Be scared. Be tired. Be messy. And let yourself be loved there." Her eyes filled with tears. She had never believed that her brokenness could be lovable. She had always felt she had to be the light for others, never realizing that the light within her was dimming from lack of rest. That season, she stayed longer. She walked without makeup. She laughed without needing to be the funniest. She let others carry the conversations. And in the simplicity of being held, she remembered something powerful. She was enough even when she wasn't giving. The man spoke often of enoughness. "You are not worthy because of what you produce. You are worthy because you are alive." It was a truth so simple that many missed it. But those who allowed it to enter their bones found it changed everything. There was an old man who had spent his entire life trying to prove himself to his father, long dead. He had climbed corporate ladders, built wealth, achieved more than most. But there was still a void in him, a quiet desperation to hear, "I'm proud of you." One afternoon, sitting beneath a fig tree, he shared this with the man. "I keep waiting for the feeling of arrival," he said, "but it never comes." "Because the one you're waiting to arrive isn't outside of you," the man replied. "It's the boy inside who still thinks he's not enough." The old man blinked. "Then what do I do?" "Go to him," the quiet man said. "Sit with him. Tell him he did enough. Tell him he is safe now." That night, the old man sat alone, hand over his heart, and for the first time, he didn't dismiss the ache. He didn't try to be strong. He imagined the boy he used to be, anxious, eager, afraid, and he whispered, "You were always enough. You don't have to keep proving it." And in that moment, decades of striving began to soften. Because healing is not about fixing the present. It's about honoring the past, the parts of you that were never held, never heard, never told they were okay. The man believed that true freedom was not in escaping the past, but in embracing it. There was a traveler who came to the village seeking clarity. She had read all the books, meditated every day, followed every practice, yet she still felt disconnected. The man listened as she listed everything she had done. And then he asked, "But when was the last time you simply sat with yourself without trying to change anything?" She hesitated. "I don't know if I ever have." "Then begin there," he said. "Begin by being with yourself exactly as you are." She tried it that night. No affirmations, no techniques, just presence. And it was uncomfortable. Her mind raced, her heart ached. But something in her knew this was the doorway, not through more doing, but through deeper being. The man knew that the soul does not respond to effort. It responds to invitation, to softness, to safety. And so he lived in a way that created that safety for himself and for others. He walked slowly. He spoke thoughtfully. He rested often. He held himself with the same tenderness he offered others. And in that way of living, he reminded everyone around him that they could too. That peace was not something to be earned. It was something to be remembered. Not in the noise, but in the stillness. Not in perfection, but in presence. Not someday, but now. Always now. There are turning points in life that make no sound when they arrive. No trumpets to announce their presence. No signs to mark their importance. Just a quiet pause, a deep breath, and something shifts. Something you may not even recognize until much later. Perhaps it's the moment you stop justifying your pain. Perhaps it's the moment you no longer feel the need to explain your boundaries. Or maybe it's the simple, quiet choice to stay with yourself instead of abandoning who you are to be accepted by someone else. The quiet man had long understood the nature of these moments. He didn't chase after them, didn't try to create them. He let them come like rain, naturally, unexpectedly, and always on time. He knew that the soul ripens on its own schedule, that no truth, no matter how profound, will take root if the ground is not yet ready. And so he waited. He lived. He watched. And when a soul was ready to see itself, he offered no lessons, only presence. There was a girl in the village who had spent years chasing light. Not the light of wisdom, but the light of positivity. She had been told that to be loved, she must always be cheerful, always be strong, always be grateful. And so she learned to smile through sadness, to stay quiet when her soul wanted to scream, to find silver linings even when she was drowning. She believed that this was what made her lovable. But the truth has a way of finding its way through even the tightest cracks. And one day the facade began to crumble. She felt angry, not at anyone in particular, just angry. And that anger frightened her. She tried to suppress it, to pray it away, to replace it with gratitude. But the more she denied it, the louder it became, until she could no longer contain it. She came to the quiet man, trembling, ashamed. "I don't want to be angry," she said. "It makes me feel wrong, broken." He looked at her with deep compassion. "Anger is not wrong. It is a message. It is the part of you that has waited too long to be heard." "But I don't want to hurt anyone," she whispered. But the truth has a way of finding its way through even the tightest cracks. And one day the facade began to crumble. She felt angry, not at anyone in particular, just angry. And that anger frightened her. She tried to suppress it, to pray it away, to replace it with gratitude. But the more she denied it, the louder it became, until she could no longer contain it. She came to the quiet man, trembling, ashamed. "I don't want to be angry," she said. "It makes me feel wrong, broken." He looked at her with deep compassion. "Anger is not wrong. It is a message. It is the part of you that has waited too long to be heard." "But I don't want to hurt anyone," she whispered. And the more she listened, the less angry she became. Not because the anger disappeared, but because it had finally been heard. The quiet man believed that all emotions were sacred, that none of them were enemies. He didn't separate feelings into good and bad. To him, every emotion was an invitation. Sadness asked for rest, joy asked for presence, grief asked for remembrance, fear asked for safety, and anger asked for boundaries. There was a man who had spent most of his life trying to be nice. Not kind, nice. The kind of nice that avoids conflict, the kind that swallows truth, the kind that would rather be uncomfortable than make someone else uncomfortable. He had always believed that this made him a good person, but over time, he began to feel resentful, invisible, hollow. He came to the man, unsure of what was wrong. "I'm not unhappy," he said, "but I feel numb." The quiet man nodded slowly. "Because you've made comfort your God, and comfort, when worshipped, becomes a cage." The words pierced, not in a cruel way, but like a key turning in a long locked door. "What do I do?" the man asked. "Tell the truth," the quiet man replied. "Not with cruelty, with courage." So the man began to practice honesty. At first it was terrifying. Speaking up, saying no, naming his needs. But with every act of truth, something within him began to wake up. He felt alive, not always liked, not always understood, but real. And that realness, that sacred authenticity, became the foundation of a new life. Because there comes a time when the cost of fitting in becomes too high, when staying silent is more painful than being misunderstood, when peace no longer comes from avoiding discomfort, but from walking through it with open eyes and an open heart. The quiet man had walked through this fire himself. There was a time when he had betrayed his own truth for acceptance. He had kept quiet when everything inside him cried out to speak. He had stayed in places where his soul was starving, just to avoid being alone. But one day he realized that no company was worth the cost of his own voice. And so he left. Not to run away, but to return. To his voice, his path, his peace. He once said, "Aloneness is not loneliness. It is the space in which your true self returns to you." And he had come to love that space. He didn't need constant conversation. He didn't fear empty rooms, because he was no longer a stranger to himself. There was a woman who had just ended a long relationship. She came to the man heartbroken, unsure of who she was without the other person. "I don't know how to be alone," she said. He replied, "Then be with yourself. Don't try to fill the space. Feel the space. Listen to what it wants to show you." So she did. At first, the silence was unbearable, the ache of absence, the weight of memory. But slowly she began to hear her own voice again. She danced to music she loved. She made meals just for herself. She took long walks and whispered kind things to the trees. And in that solitude, she found something she had never found in partnership: self-intimacy, because true intimacy doesn't begin with another. It begins with you, your willingness to know yourself, to hold your own hand, to become your own companion. The quiet man believed that most relationships fail not from lack of love, but from lack of self-awareness. People expect others to fill the voids they refuse to face, but two half-selves do not make a whole. Only when you meet yourself fully can you meet another truly. He had known deep love in his life, love that awakened him, love that broke him, love that returned him to himself. And through it all, he learned that love is not something you fall into. It's something you rise through. It's not a destination. It's a practice, a choice to be present again and again, even when it's hard. One afternoon, a couple came to him, struggling with distance. Not physical distance, but emotional disconnection. "We don't fight," they said, "but we feel like strangers." The quiet man listened, then said, "Because you've stopped being curious. Love dies when we think we know everything about someone." They blinked. It was true. They had stopped asking questions, stopped learning each other, stopped sharing the little things. They lived together, but they no longer truly saw each other. So he gave them a task. "Every day, ask one question you've never asked before." They laughed. It seemed silly, but they agreed. Weeks later, they returned, glowing. They had discovered things they'd never known: fears, dreams, memories. They began to fall in love again, not with a fantasy, but with the real, evolving human being beside them. Because love is not sustained by certainty, it's sustained by wonder. And that wonder, that sacred curiosity, is the heartbeat of presence. The quiet man knew that presence was the medicine most people were truly starving for. Not advice, not solutions, just presence. The presence that says, "I'm here." And so he offered that medicine every day, not with words, with being. There is a certain kind of strength that doesn't roar. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't wear a crown or arrive with thunder. It sits quietly in the soul of someone who has walked through their own darkness and chosen to stay kind. Someone who has learned to hold themselves when the world could not. Someone who has felt broken, unworthy, unseen, and still chose to rise with softness. This kind of strength can't be taught. It can only be remembered. The quiet man in the village had watched this strength grow in many. He knew what it looked like, not in the way someone stood tall, but in the way they didn't shrink. Not in the way they conquered others, but in how they faced themselves. There were no badges for it, no trophies. Just the quiet knowing that you have become someone you no longer need to run from. There was a young girl in the village who had always been praised for her sweetness. She was polite, obedient, easy to be around, but beneath that carefully crafted identity was a storm, a fierce, wild, burning truth that she had never dared to show. Whenever she tried to speak up, someone would say, "Don't be so dramatic." Whenever she questioned something, they'd say, "You think too much." So she learned to silence herself, to smile when she wanted to scream, to make others comfortable, even when it made her suffer. She came to the man one summer evening, frustration simmering beneath her soft words. "I'm tired," she said, "but I don't know what from." The man looked at her with eyes that had seen many versions of the same pain. "You're tired from pretending," he said, "from holding in your fire so others can stay warm." Her breath caught. A part of her felt exposed, but a deeper part felt relieved, as if someone had finally named what she couldn't. She nodded slowly. "But if I stop being what they expect, what if they leave?" He smiled gently. "If they leave, let them. Let the ones who only love the mask walk away. You don't need that kind of love. You need the kind that stays when you take the mask off. The truth of his words sat with her for days. She began to notice every time she swallowed her truth, every time she laughed when something hurt, every time she agreed just to keep the peace. And slowly, she began to choose herself. She said no for the first time. She shared an opinion even when it shook. She let herself cry in front of someone without apologizing for the tears. And with every act of honesty, she grew stronger. Not louder, just clearer. Not tougher, just truer. And for the first time, she felt free. The quiet man knew that freedom didn't always look like leaving everything behind. Sometimes freedom is choosing to stay with yourself no matter what. To stay with your pain, your joy, your truth, especially when others don't. There was an older man in the village who had lived a life of quiet resignation. He had done what was expected, married the right person, worked the right job, saved the right amount. But somewhere along the way, he had lost his passion. His days felt like repetition. His smile didn't reach his eyes. And now, as he grew older, he was haunted not by mistakes, but by moments he had never claimed. He came to the quiet man and asked, "Is it too late?" The man looked at him thoughtfully. "Too late for what?" "To live," the older man said. The quiet man smiled. "As long as you're still breathing, you're still becoming." The words startled him. He had never thought of life that way. Not as a line you follow, but as a wave you ride. He had believed that certain doors closed forever, that missed chances stayed missed. But now something opened inside him. A door he thought had rusted shut, so he began to reclaim pieces of himself. He picked up the guitar he hadn't touched in 30 years. He started writing poetry again, just for himself. He stopped wearing clothes that felt like uniforms and started dressing in colors that felt alive. People were confused at first. His wife didn't understand. His children thought it was a phase. But he didn't need them to understand. He only needed to listen to the part of him that had been waiting all these years to be remembered. The quiet man believed that age had nothing to do with becoming, that the soul doesn't measure in years, it measures in awakenings. And some people wake up at 19, others at 90. The timing doesn't matter, the returning does. He once said, "You can't go back and write a new beginning, but you can start now and write a new ending." And that truth gave many the courage to begin again. There was a traveler who passed through the village, young, ambitious, full of questions. He was searching for purpose, desperate to make his life mean something. He asked the man, "How do I know if I'm on the right path?" The man looked at him and asked, "Does it bring you peace?" The traveler hesitated.